This is my true story. I worked for every dollar I ever had. I saved, invested, and built a life that I thought my family would respect. But one afternoon, my daughter came into my house with papers in her hand and said, "Mom, you can't handle your own money anymore." She smiled as she took control of what I built. I stayed calm, but I didn't forget. 2 days later, she walked into the bank and I was already waiting in the manager's chair. What happened next changed everything. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. She came over that morning acting unusually sweet, carrying a folder under her arm like she was doing me a favor. She made tea, sat across from me, and started talking about how much she worried about my future. She said I seemed tired lately, that I was getting older, that managing bills and payments could become too stressful. She spoke like she was offering love, but every word carried control. Then she pulled out the papers and said it was for my safety. She told me she'd arranged something called a temporary management transfer so she could help me with my finances. She said it would protect me from scams, from bad decisions, from forgetting things. I told her I didn't need help, but she insisted, saying it was just a formality. I trusted her, maybe because I wanted to believe she was being a good daughter. I signed the papers without reading them, thinking it was something small. She thanked me, kissed my cheek, and left, smiling like she had done something noble. That night, I sat down to pay my bills and opened my bank app, only to see a balance that said 0. For a moment, I thought it was an error. I refreshed the page. Still 0. I opened the savings account. 0 again. The retirement fund, the joint account, everything. Gone. I stared at the screen, frozen. My breath felt heavy, my fingers shaking, but not out of panic. It was disbelief, the kind that turns into anger only after silence. I closed the laptop and sat back, thinking through every conversation, every detail of that morning. She hadn't come to protect me. She had come to take everything. My daughter, the one I'd raised alone, the one I'd sacrificed for, the one I'd sent to college with my savings, had taken what I earned as if it were hers. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't even call her. I went straight to my phone, searched the number for the bank, and called the manager directly. He had known me for years. I'd been a customer there for over 2 decades. I asked if there had been any transfers recently. He paused for a moment, then said yes, there was a large one. When I asked where it went, he said it was a temporary guardianship transfer for account management, authorized by me. My voice stayed calm. I asked him to send me every document with my signature. He hesitated, but eventually agreed. He told me to come in the next morning to collect the copies in person. I thanked him and hung up. I sat awake most of that night, not out of sadness but focus. I made a list of every account, every investment, every piece of property I had. I wrote everything down on paper, line by line, like I used to do when I was younger and couldn't trust computers. I went through every statement I had printed, every old folder. By the time the sun rose, I was ready. I wasn't broken. I wasn't defeated. I was angry, but in control. That morning, I dressed neatly, put my papers into a small handbag, and went straight to the bank. The manager was waiting for me. When he handed me the copies, I looked through them one by one. The signatures were mine, but not all of them. A few initials were slightly off, tilted differently. I noticed where the ink looked traced, where the pressure didn't match. I asked for extra copies, and he printed them without a word. I left the branch with every sheet of proof I needed. Outside the bank, I stood on the sidewalk with my purse held tight against me and the papers folded under my arm. The street was busy, cars passing, people talking. But all I could hear was the steady sound of my own decision forming. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. She thought she could outsmart me, but she had forgotten one thing. Everything she knew about handling money, she had learned from me. And that meant I already knew exactly how to undo her mistake. When I got home, I put the folder on my desk, made a list of names, and started planning who to call next. I didn't need to fight. I just needed to follow the system better than she did. The next morning, I went back to the bank as soon as it opened. The manager greeted me at the counter, his face showing concern. He led me into his office, closed the door, and sat me down with a folder of documents. He began to explain what had happened. According to their system, I had authorized something called temporary guardianship management, which allowed my daughter to move funds between my accounts and hers freely. She had told them I was becoming forgetful and that she was helping me organize my finances before something went wrong. The bank believed her because the signatures matched, or so they thought. I kept my expression calm and asked who approved it. He said I did, pointing to the forms I had signed 2 days earlier. I nodded and asked for every copy with my name on it. He printed them all, one after another, until the stack was several inches thick. I flipped through them carefully, page by page, taking my time, letting him watch as I studied each signature. Every initial was mine, but some lines felt different, rushed, forced, slightly altered. I had signed part of it, but she had added extra pages later, forging the rest. When I reached the last page, the one where her account number appeared as secondary holder, I closed the folder and asked him quietly if it was legal for her to move everything into her personal account without my written consent on those sections. He hesitated, then admitted it was not. He said she had misled the staff and taken advantage of the bank's assumption of honesty between family members. He looked embarrassed when he said it, like he couldn't believe someone would go that far. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said I wanted the issue corrected, but I wanted to do it the right way, documented, witnessed, and irreversible. He nodded and said he would cooperate fully. He gave me his card, told me he would prepare the reversal forms, and said I could bring my lawyer to make the process smoother. I thanked him, stood up, and left. The entire conversation took less than 20 minutes, but in those 20 minutes, the balance of power shifted completely. When I stepped outside, the morning sun was bright. I walked to a small cafe across the street, ordered black coffee, and sat down at a corner table with my documents spread in front of me. I read through every line, memorizing the details, the dates, the authorizations, the bank's internal reference numbers. I didn't want revenge. I wanted precision. If I acted emotionally, she would spin the story. If I acted strategically, she would have nowhere to run. I wrote down the manager's exact words on a napkin so I wouldn't forget. Temporary guardianship, misleading authorization. Those two phrases would be the foundation of what came next. I finished my coffee, folded the papers, and walked straight to my lawyer's office. He had worked with me for years and trusted my judgment. When I handed him the folder, he read silently for nearly 10 minutes before speaking. He said there was enough to not only reverse the transfer, but also flag her actions under financial misrepresentation. I asked if we could do it quietly, without involving the police, and he said yes, as long as the bank cooperated. We scheduled a meeting for the next morning at the branch. He said it would be better if my accountant joined as well, to verify every figure and ensure the funds were restored accurately. I agreed immediately. I wasn't going to take chances. When I left his office, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like the person I used to be, disciplined, sharp, and in control. I had spent my life managing numbers, paying bills, calculating savings, balancing everything on my own. I had never needed anyone to handle my money before, and I certainly didn't need anyone now. As I walked home, I kept thinking about the look on her face when she realized she had underestimated me. She thought age made me weak. What she didn't know was that experience never fades. It just waits for the right moment to speak. That moment was coming soon. I wasn't going to call her or warn her. I was going to let her walk right into her own lesson, the kind you can't erase from a bank statement. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. I got dressed neatly in the same kind of clothes I used to wear when I worked at the office. I wanted to look calm, composed, and professional. I gathered all the documents, the copies from the bank, and the notes I had made. Then I called my lawyer and my accountant. They were both people who had known me for years. I told them exactly what had happened and that I wanted to meet at the bank that day. My lawyer said he would contact the branch manager to schedule an appointment. He told me not to speak directly to my daughter before the meeting, not to give her any warning, and not to show any emotion. I agreed. Within an hour, I received a call from the bank confirming a private meeting at noon. I wrote the time on a small notepad and waited quietly. I didn't feel nervous. I felt focused. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth and respect. At exactly 11:30, I left my house and arrived at the bank 15 minutes early. The manager saw me enter and immediately stood to greet me. My lawyer and accountant arrived shortly after, both carrying briefcases. The meeting room was small but quiet, with a glass door and a large wooden table. The manager closed the door and explained that he had prepared all necessary forms to reverse the transfer. But to make it official, my daughter needed to be present. I told him that was exactly what I wanted. He looked slightly uncomfortable, as if he knew it might be an emotional scene, but I assured him I would remain calm. He said he would call her and tell her the bank needed her to verify a few details related to routine compliance. She agreed to come in the afternoon. I could almost hear her confidence through the phone. She had no idea what was waiting for her. After the call, I spent the next hour reviewing the papers with my lawyer and accountant. They explained what each document meant, what section to sign, and what to expect when she arrived. The plan was simple. The bank would confirm the forgery and then immediately transfer the funds back into my account under legal supervision. The process would be recorded on video, as required by policy, and I would walk out with written proof of everything. My lawyer suggested I stay behind the desk when she entered. The manager agreed, saying it would emphasize who actually held authority. I didn't argue. It was poetic in its own quiet way, not through words, but through position. When everything was ready, I excused myself to use the restroom. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and smiled faintly. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like someone who had finally taken control again. For months I had been doubted, dismissed, treated like I was fragile or incapable. But sitting there in that chair with those papers in my hand reminded me of the strength that built my entire life. I walked back into the room, took my seat, and folded my hands neatly on the table. The manager sat across from me, my lawyer to my right, my accountant beside him. The clock ticked softly. Every sound in the room felt louder than it really was. The air conditioner humming, the clicking of pens, the faint shuffle of paper. 5 minutes before 2 o'clock, the manager's assistant peeked in and whispered that she had arrived. The manager looked at me and asked if I was ready. I nodded. He told the assistant to bring her in. I could hear her voice from down the hallway, cheerful, confident, greeting the staff like she owned the place. The door opened, and the room went quiet. She stepped inside, dressed perfectly, holding her phone in one hand and her purse in the other. She smiled when she saw the manager, but that smile faded instantly when she saw me sitting behind his desk. She stopped walking, her expression freezing halfway between surprise and guilt. I didn't move. I simply looked at her, calm, steady, without saying a word. The manager gestured toward the seat across from me and said softly, "We just have a few details to confirm." She sat down slowly, still trying to process what was happening. I could see her breathing change, her confidence fading. The meeting had begun, and for the first time, I wasn't the one being managed. The manager started by thanking her for coming in, speaking in that polite, professional tone banks always use when something serious is about to happen. She smiled, pretending to be relaxed, still not understanding what was waiting for her. She thought it was just a small update or signature request. She set her bag down on the chair beside her, crossed her legs, and glanced at me quickly before turning her attention back to the manager. He handed her a form to verify, but the real reason she was there was written in the folder sitting right in front of me, the documents she forged. I waited for the right moment. My lawyer sat quietly to my right, pen in hand, watching everything closely. My accountant reviewed numbers silently, page by page, as if this were just another day at work. The tension in the room was thick enough to feel, but I stayed calm. I had already made peace with what was about to happen. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted her to see the difference between taking care of someone and taking from them. The manager cleared his throat and said, "Before we proceed, Mrs. wanted to ask a few questions." He nodded toward me. She turned, confused, like she wasn't sure why I was suddenly part of this meeting. When I didn't speak right away, she tried to smile. That nervous, fake smile she used when she felt caught. I slid the folder across the table slowly. Her eyes dropped to it, and the color in her face changed. She recognized the papers immediately, the same ones she had made me sign, the ones she said were for my safety. I opened the folder and spread them across the table. "Do these look familiar?" I asked, keeping my voice level and steady. She didn't answer. I pointed to one signature at the bottom of a page. "This one's mine," I said. But this one here, on the second line, it isn't. The manager leaned forward and compared them carefully. He nodded once and said, "Yes, there are inconsistencies." My lawyer leaned over next, examining both pages, and circled the mismatched initials. My daughter tried to explain, but her words stumbled. She said she must have helped fill them out, that it was a misunderstanding, that she didn't mean to confuse anyone. But her voice shook with every sentence. The manager kept his tone professional, but firm. He said the transfer could not legally continue under such conditions, and that the funds would need to be reversed immediately pending review. Her face went blank. She looked from him to me and back again, realizing this was no misunderstanding. My lawyer began listing the specific sections that were violated, reading them aloud one by one. He spoke clearly, emphasizing phrases like unauthorized access and account manipulation. The words filled the room like quiet thunder. My accountant started printing the reversal documents while the manager updated the system. I watched her expression shift from confusion to panic. She reached for her phone, but the manager stopped her, reminding her that phones weren't allowed during official reversal processes. She sat frozen, fingers trembling slightly, unable to decide whether to speak or stay silent. I said nothing more. The situation spoke for itself. When the printer finished, the manager slid the reversal authorization form toward me. I signed it slowly, making sure every stroke of the pen was clear. Then he printed the updated balance sheet and showed it on the screen. My accounts were back in my name, every cent returned, every access revoked. Her name disappeared from the system right in front of her eyes. She leaned back in her chair, pale and quiet, watching years of entitlement vanish in seconds. The manager handed me my new debit card and confirmation letter. My lawyer nodded in approval and said, "That will do." As the meeting ended, I stood up first. She stayed seated, still trying to absorb what had just happened. I thanked the manager and his staff for their time, shook hands with my lawyer and accountant, and walked out of the room with my head high. Behind me, I heard her whisper my name softly, almost as if she couldn't believe what had happened. But I didn't turn around. The setup was complete. The truth had been signed, sealed, and filed, and she finally understood that I was not the one who needed supervision. The silence in the room stretched for a long time after the signatures were done. The only sound was the soft clicking of the manager's keyboard as he finalized the entries. My daughter sat still, her hands clasped together tightly on her lap, eyes fixed on the screen as the numbers changed. Her confidence had vanished completely. The manager printed the final statement, stamped it, and handed it to me first. He then turned to her and said calmly, "Mrs., the bank has completed the reversal. The balance in your account is now 0. The funds have been restored to the original owner." She blinked slowly, as if she didn't understand the words. My lawyer leaned forward slightly, his tone quiet but firm, and said, "You signed under false authority. That is fraud. But since the funds have been returned, my client will not pursue further action if you leave this matter closed." Her lips trembled, and she tried to argue that it had all been a misunderstanding, that she only wanted to help. I said nothing. The manager added, "We will still need a written statement for compliance purposes." She looked at him in disbelief. Her eyes darted around the room like she was searching for someone to defend her. No one did. My lawyer passed her a blank page and a pen. She picked it up slowly and began writing, her handwriting shaky, her words slow and uneven. I could see her trying to choose sentences that made her look innocent, but it didn't matter anymore. The evidence was already clear. I leaned back in my chair, calm, watching her every movement. The power she had taken so easily was gone, and she was feeling the weight of her choices. The manager read over her statement when she finished, signed it, and told her it would be filed internally. Then he turned the papers toward her, asking her to acknowledge the reversal with her signature. When she did, I could see her hands trembling. The atmosphere changed after that moment. The bank staff no longer looked at her the same way. The polite smiles were gone. Everyone was professional, but distant, as if they understood who had been wronged. My accountant double-checked the final numbers, verifying that every cent was accounted for. My lawyer took copies of all documents for his record. The manager printed an official summary of the incident for my file and handed it to me. I placed it neatly in my folder and stood up, thanking him for his cooperation. He nodded respectfully and said, "You handled this very gracefully." I smiled faintly and replied, "It's easier to stay calm when you know the truth is on your side." Before leaving, the compliance officer from the bank came in to confirm a few details. He asked her to remain seated for a brief follow-up. She looked at him, stunned, realizing the meeting wasn't over for her. He said the bank needed to review why her name had been added to the account and how the process had bypassed standard verification. She tried to explain again, but her voice cracked. He gestured toward a small side office and said it wouldn't take long. My lawyer and I walked out together, leaving her behind with the officer. As I passed through the glass door, I caught a glimpse of her reflection. She looked pale, smaller somehow, as if the confidence she once wore like armor had dissolved completely. Outside the bank, the air felt lighter. I thanked my lawyer and accountant for their help. My lawyer said, "You did everything right. You stayed quiet until it mattered." I nodded. That was the point. Silence, when used wisely, is stronger than anger. I drove home, parked in front of my house, and sat for a while in the car. I wasn't thinking about what she had done anymore. I was thinking about what I had just proven. That age doesn't make someone weak, and experience doesn't fade with time. It just waits. It watches. It learns when to act. That day she had learned too, though not the way she expected. I didn't need to shout, cry, or beg for respect. I earned it back with one meeting, one signature, and one truth made public. The manager began typing the final commands into the system, confirming that every account connected to her access was now under review. I watched the monitor from across the desk as the numbers shifted, as the ownership lines updated, as every trace of her control disappeared one by one. The bank's software made a faint clicking sound each time a change was processed. To anyone else, it might have sounded ordinary, but to me, it sounded like justice. She sat frozen, staring at the screen as the balance on her own account began to fall toward zero. I could tell she wanted to protest, but there was nothing left for her to say. The evidence was too clear. The manager printed the reversal confirmation sheet and turned it toward her to read. "These are the final figures," he said. "Mrs. has full and sole control again. You are no longer listed as an authorized user." He kept his voice calm, professional, respectful to me, but firm with her. My lawyer reviewed the paper carefully, then signed his verification at the bottom. My accountant did the same. The manager handed me a pen next. I took it slowly, signed my name where it belonged, and handed it back. My daughter didn't move. The manager looked at her again and said, "We'll need your signature here as acknowledgement of the reversal." She hesitated for a long moment. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with tension. Finally, she reached for the pen with a shaking hand and scribbled her name in the space provided. Her voice was small when she asked, "Is that it?" The manager replied, "That's it. You no longer have any access to her finances." He paused for a second and added, "The bank will send a notice to your address confirming the termination." Her shoulders slumped. She tried to smile weakly, as if pretending it didn't hurt, but her face couldn't hold the act. I could see the embarrassment creeping in. She had walked into this building thinking she controlled everything. Now she couldn't even control her expression. The manager printed a new card for me, placed it in an envelope, and handed it to me personally. "This is your updated access information," he said. "All accounts are now protected under your sole signature." I thanked him quietly. My lawyer leaned over and whispered that this was the cleanest reversal he had seen in years. He told me to keep all documents stored safely and to avoid adding anyone else to my accounts in the future. I told him I would, and that this was the last time anyone would misuse my trust. My daughter stared at the floor, her eyes red, her lips pressed together tightly. The manager offered her a glass of water, but she shook her head. She wanted to leave, but the compliance officer still had a few forms to complete. The room stayed silent for several minutes while the printer worked. I glanced at her once more and realized she still hadn't fully grasped the weight of what she had done. She thought she could handle everything behind my back, but the truth had caught up faster than she expected. When the reversal process was fully confirmed, the manager stood and extended his hand toward me. "Congratulations, Mrs." he said. "Your accounts are secure again." I shook his hand and smiled slightly. It wasn't joy that I felt. It was relief. relief that my life was back in my hands where it belonged. The lawyer gathered the folders, the accountant closed his laptop, and we all prepared to leave. My daughter stood up slowly, still looking dazed, as if she had woken from a dream she didn't like. She asked the manager softly if the reversal was permanent. He nodded. "Permanent," he said firmly. She blinked and looked down again. The manager thanked me for my patience and walked me to the door. I stepped out first. She followed behind, still pale, still silent. In the waiting area, a few customers turned their heads as we walked by. They could sense something had happened, even without words. Outside, the sunlight was harsh and bright. I paused on the steps and looked back through the glass doors. She was still inside, standing near the counter, staring at the floor. Her reflection looked like a stranger. For years, she had seen me as old, fragile, dependent. But at that moment, she saw what I had always been, capable, steady, and unwilling to be erased. The reversal wasn't just about money. It was about control, respect, and truth. I got all three back that day. The compliance officer stepped forward just as I was preparing to leave. He asked her to stay behind for a few minutes to clear up a few verification points. His tone was polite, but his eyes told a different story. She froze in place, unsure if she should argue or comply. I watched from the doorway as she looked toward me for help, but I gave her nothing, just the same calm expression I had worn since the start. She had created this mess herself. The manager gestured toward a smaller office off to the side of the main lobby. She walked in slowly, clutching her handbag like it could protect her. The door closed behind her with a soft but final click. I turned to the lawyer beside me, and we stepped into the hall. Through the glass window, I could see her sitting there, answering questions she didn't want to hear. The compliance officer slid a stack of papers across the desk. Internal review forms, statements about authorization, and identification checks. Her mouth moved fast, but her hands trembled. Every now and then she looked up at the officer's face, probably hoping to find sympathy. There was none. While she sat there, the manager walked over to me again. He said quietly, "You should know, the bank takes this kind of breach seriously. She may face a temporary restriction from opening new accounts." I nodded and thanked him. My lawyer whispered that we had done enough and didn't need to stay any longer. Still, I stayed near the door for a moment longer, watching her face through the glass. The expression she wore was one I had never seen on her before. Not anger, not arrogance, just pure shock. She had gone from confident to cornered in less than an hour. The woman who thought she could take everything from me was now sitting in the same chair where people go when they have to explain themselves to authority. It was a perfect picture of accountability. After a few more minutes, she tried to stand up, but the compliance officer motioned for her to sit down again. He was reviewing her written statement from earlier and asking questions about the forged signatures. I couldn't hear their voices, but her body language said everything. She leaned forward, pleading, then leaned back, defeated. The lawyer and accountant joined me by the exit and reminded me that we had a follow-up appointment scheduled for later in the week to finalize my new account protections. I told them I'd be there. When we walked outside, I could still see her through the glass, her head lowered, one hand covering her mouth like she was trying not to cry. Outside, the air felt cooler than before. The parking lot was half full, but it felt empty compared to the noise inside. My lawyer shook my hand, said he'd send the official report later that day, and left. My accountant waved and headed to his car. I stayed for a few seconds longer, watching the bank's automatic doors slide open and close for strangers who had no idea what had just happened inside. When I finally turned to leave, I felt no anger, no revenge, only relief. It wasn't about winning. It was about ending something that had gone too far. She had crossed a line, and I had redrawn it in permanent ink. When I got home, my phone buzzed within an hour. The bank had already called her. They were filing a note on her record for unauthorized management of client assets. That meant any financial institution she tried to deal with in the future would see it. I sat on my porch watching the sunset, sipping tea, and listening to the sound of my phone vibrating again. This time, it wasn't a bank or a lawyer. It was her. I let it ring. Then it rang again and again. She called 12 times in a row before finally sending a message. "Mom, please call me." I read it once and set the phone face down. She needed to sit in the silence she created, the same silence she once gave me when she took everything from my name. Later that night, I received an email from the bank confirming the completion of the reversal. Attached was a statement that showed my balance fully restored. I opened it and stared at the numbers for a while, not because I needed to check, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to have control again. I forwarded the document to my lawyer, closed my laptop, and turned off the light. In that darkness, I smiled for the first time in weeks, not out of satisfaction, but out of certainty. She had been called in for answers, but the truth had already spoken. The next morning, the story had already spread farther than either of us expected. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when something happens inside the main branch of the local bank. By the time I went in to sign a few final documents, the tellers and even some customers recognized me. They whispered quietly, polite but curious. I ignored them. I wasn't there for attention. I was there to close the final part of the process. My daughter arrived a few minutes later, looking exhausted, her eyes swollen from crying. She didn't look at me when she walked past, but people noticed her. It's hard to stay invisible when guilt clings to every movement. The manager nodded respectfully at me and guided her to a private booth where the compliance officer handed her a written summary of the investigation results. Her name was blacklisted for temporary banking authority, and her access rights were suspended across multiple accounts. It was official now, and it was permanent. She signed the acknowledgement slowly, her hands trembling the same way they had the day before. When she left the booth, people looked up. It wasn't out of cruelty or gossip, it was curiosity. Everyone knew something serious had happened, and in small towns, curiosity doesn't need details. I stood by the window, pretending to check my bag while watching her walk out the door. She kept her head down, clutching her purse to her chest like it could hide her shame. Outside, I saw her step into the parking lot, pause for a moment, and take a deep breath as if she wanted to disappear. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. Later that afternoon, my phone started buzzing again. Not from her this time, but from relatives. My sister-in-law called first, asking what had happened because my niece had seen a post online. Apparently, someone from the bank had told someone else, and by the time it reached social media, the story had turned into a family scandal. I didn't deny it. I simply said the truth, that my daughter had tried to take over my accounts, and I had fixed it. Silence followed on the other end of the line, then a quiet, "Good for you." That evening, my nephew texted me a screenshot. It was a post my daughter had made earlier in the day before deleting it. She had written, "People love to twist stories when they don't understand love." The comments underneath were not what she expected. Most people didn't sympathize. They questioned her. Some even reminded her that no love justifies stealing from a parent. By the end of the night, she deleted her account. Family members began calling one another, gossiping about who was right and who was wrong. I stayed out of it. I didn't need to explain anything. The truth was, in every document, every signature, every transaction reversed. I didn't have to speak a word. The story had already spoken for me. 2 days later, I went to the grocery store, and the cashier smiled at me differently. It wasn't pity, it was respect. She said quietly, "You handled it well, Mrs. Name." I thanked her and moved on. That simple moment meant more than any apology ever could. I realized people had been watching, not for drama, but for proof that dignity still existed in a world full of quick betrayals. My daughter, meanwhile, had stopped calling. I heard from a friend that she was struggling financially now. The same account she once controlled had left her with none of the comfort she had stolen. She had to start over, and maybe that was her lesson. You can rebuild money, but you can't rebuild trust once it's gone. The following week, my lawyer called to confirm that everything had been settled. No further action was necessary. The bank had filed a report noting that the issue had been resolved without escalation. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat in my living room, looking out the window, watching the world move on while I sat in peace. There was no more noise, no more pretending, no more imbalance. The public scene was over, but its echo remained. Every whisper in town, every curious look at the bank, every deleted post online, they all told the same quiet truth. The mother she tried to silence had spoken louder, without ever raising her voice. The days after the bank meeting felt quiet, almost too quiet. The phone that used to ring constantly with her calls and questions about money stopped ringing altogether. No texts, no messages, no updates. It was as if she had vanished. I knew it wasn't guilt keeping her away, it was embarrassment. Pride takes longer to heal than wounds. She had been so sure she was doing the right thing, convincing herself that taking control of my finances was for my safety. Now she knew the truth, that control was never hers to take. The silence in my house felt heavy but peaceful. I cooked my meals, paid my bills, and slept without that constant thought of someone watching my accounts. I didn't check my balance out of fear anymore. I checked it out of satisfaction. Every transaction was mine again, every cent accounted for, every number where it should be. After a week, the silence broke. One evening, my phone buzzed and her name appeared on the screen. I didn't answer the first call. It rang again and again until I finally picked up. Her voice was soft, unsteady, the kind of tone people use when they've lost the confidence they once lived on. She said she was sorry for how things had happened, that she didn't mean for it to go that far. She said she just wanted to make sure I was safe, that she was trying to help. I listened quietly without interrupting. When she finished, I asked one question: if she would have ever told me about it if she hadn't been caught. There was no answer, just silence, the kind that stretches between two people who both know the truth but are too tired to say it out loud. I told her I wasn't angry anymore, but I was disappointed. Then I hung up. I didn't shout, I didn't argue, and I didn't let her explain further. Some lessons lose their meaning when you give them room to breathe. A few days later, she came to visit unannounced. She stood at my door holding a box of pastries from the bakery she knew I liked. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, and her voice small. She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I invited her in out of courtesy, not forgiveness. We sat in the kitchen, and she started talking about how she'd been losing sleep, how her friends had distanced themselves, and how she couldn't believe the bank had handled things the way they did. She wanted to rewrite the story, to make it about misunderstanding instead of deception. I let her talk. When she finished, I told her plainly that love without respect isn't love at all. It's control disguised as care. She looked down, unable to meet my eyes. I poured tea for both of us. We sat in silence, sipping slowly, pretending the conversation wasn't over, even though it already was. After she left, I realized I didn't feel sad anymore. I didn't even feel angry. I felt free. The kind of freedom that comes from finally being treated like an adult again, from knowing that no one else can make decisions about your life without your consent. The silence that followed her departure wasn't the same as before. This one felt earned. It felt right. Every day that passed, I woke up lighter, like something invisible had been lifted off my shoulders. I went for walks, read the newspaper, paid my bills at the bank with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The tellers there smiled differently now, not with pity, but with respect. They had seen what happened. They had seen that I handled it with dignity. Weeks went by without another call from her. When she finally reached out again, it was through a short message that simply said, "I'm sorry, Mom." I really am. I read it once and didn't reply. Some apologies don't need answers. They need time. Time to sink in. Time to remind someone of what they almost destroyed. That message stayed unread on my screen for days until I finally deleted it. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because I had moved on. The silence she left behind was not empty anymore. It was peaceful, steady, and deserved. For the first time in years, I felt in control, not of money, not of others, but of my own life. She once told me I couldn't handle my own money, that I needed her to take care of everything because I was old, forgetful, and fragile. Those were the words that started it all, words spoken with fake concern and hidden greed. But what she didn't understand was that I had handled everything long before she was even born. I handled bills during a recession, handled hospital payments when her father got sick, handled a mortgage when banks turned people away. I built stability from nothing, and when she tried to take it, I handled that too. The moment she moved my funds into her account, she believed she had taken my control, but in reality, she only gave me another reason to prove her wrong. 2 days later, when the bank called her in and she saw me sitting in the manager's chair, it wasn't revenge that made me smile. It was justice. Quiet, calm, professional justice. She thought I was too weak to fight back, but strength doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it just signs the right paper. After that day, I learned that respect isn't something you beg for. It's something you take back when it's been misplaced. She had taken advantage of my trust, and for a long time, I blamed myself for letting her. But I realized it wasn't weakness that allowed it. It was love. Love makes you blind to motives, makes you excuse behavior you'd never accept from anyone else. I thought she was protecting me, but she was protecting her own comfort. Now, when I walk into that same bank, the tellers greet me with warmth. They know what happened. They know I stood up for myself without causing a scene. They saw how a quiet woman, written off as too old to understand, sat down with lawyers and turned the story around. That memory reminds me that age isn't the loss of power. It's the proof that you've survived enough to use it wisely. My daughter still calls occasionally, her tone softer now, her words careful. She no longer talks about money or responsibility. She talks about weather, about how her children are doing, about ordinary things that don't require trust. I let her talk. I listen, but I keep my distance. Forgiveness doesn't always mean letting someone back into your life the same way they were before. Sometimes it means giving them space to think about what they've done while you move forward. I'm not angry at her anymore. I'm not even hurt. What happened needed to happen. It drew a line between care and control, between love and manipulation. That line will never blur again. I've organized my finances now better than ever before. Everything is secure, documented, and untouchable. The bank manager even calls me the sharpest client he's met this year. It's funny how quickly people change their view when they see what you're capable of. My lawyer keeps my papers safe, my accountant checks my statements monthly, and I manage the rest myself. It feels good knowing no one can make choices for me anymore. I spend what I want, save what I want, and sleep with peace instead of worry. Every time I see my daughter, I see a reminder that respect isn't inherited, it's earned, and sometimes it's reclaimed. Looking back now, I don't regret how it happened. I don't regret the embarrassment she felt or the shock on her face when she realized her plan had failed. Those moments weren't cruelty, they were lessons. I taught her the value of boundaries, even if it came at a price. I taught her that a mother's silence doesn't mean surrender. It means calculation. It means patience. And when the right moment arrives, it means victory. She will remember that day for the rest of her life. The day she walked into the bank believing she owned everything and walked out realizing she owned nothing. That's how balance works, both in money and in life. So when people ask me how I felt watching her face go white that day, I tell them the truth. I felt calm, completely calm, because I didn't destroy her. I just corrected her mistake. She said I couldn't handle my own money. I handled her instead. The bank saw who the real adult was. She lost access, control, and respect all in one meeting. And that's the thing about lessons like these. They don't require shouting or punishment. They just need one paper, one signature, and the quiet confidence of a mother who knows exactly what she's worth.